Hey guys, hey, it's Matthew, and we are getting started or moving forward with our web design class. And we're going to be looking at the PDF for Project One. And you can kind of see it just says CV resume up here. So throughout this course, we're going to be working on a CV or a resume that is unique to you. Um, and with this sort of practical project, you're going to be learning some basics of HTML and practicing it further and getting familiar and more comfortable with all this business because it does take a little bit of time. Some folks might end up being able to do these projects within, honestly, 10, 15 minutes. And other folks, it might take them a little bit longer just because everyone is at a different comfort level with HTML or computer or everyone is just kind of learning at their own pace. So if you happen to just kind of rocket through this, that's good. And if it takes you a little bit of time, that's perfectly fine as well. Okay. So, but we did do the Project Zero project, right? And that was the Hello World thing where you created a very fast index.html with an H1 and some paragraph text. Well, with this particular project, we're going to be expanding that into a resume. And I think that I do, let's see here. You must include a section for a short bio, what types of degrees that you have, your professional experience, your community service, awards, grants, or anything else that might be relevant to your quote unquote anticipated future. The way that I see this project is that it is an opportunity for you to envision yourself 5, 10 years down the road. What kind of degrees do you want to have? Where do you want to go to school? What kind of art schools or design schools interest you? Or do you need that advanced degree to do what you want to do? Do you want to be a full-time web developer? Do you want to be a marketing director? Do you want to be an architect? Or do you want to be a full-time visual artist? Or do you want to be a professor? Or do you want to be a combination of all these things? So the CV or the resume is a really important thing that, in all honesty, I kind of wish was emphasized more when I was going to school as an undergrad. And that's why I'm trying to emphasize it here with this class, because not only A, can you envision yourself in the future, but you can also, it's a document that really shows who you are and what you're doing and what you've done. So in a way, it's kind of like an autobiography or something to that effect, but with HTML language. Um, and you get to curate what you include. You don't have to put every single show that you've been in, but or, for example, with my CV, I include projects that I've worked on, whether they were accepted or even not accepted. I still did the work, they were proposed, but I still want to include those on my CV because that was work that I did. So that's an example of, an individual making a decision as to what they want to include on their resume to show to the world. That's a snapshot of who they are professionally. It's also sort of a document that when you're applying to shows, when you're applying for exhibitions, when you're applying for grants, awards, um, when you're applying for a job, all of these things. I mean, this is the document that is going to move you forward professionally. So it's really important to kind of like think it out. Um, and again, let's see, I don't have it on this particular PDF, but of course, SNBH, thinking, planning, doing, reflecting. So in this particular circumstance, I would encourage you to maybe sit down with your sketchbook and map out, um, how are you going to use an H1? How are you going to use an H2? How are you going to use an H3? How is your CV or resume going to be structured as a Word document, but also as an HTML document? And maybe those two things kind of connect somehow, right? They can connect, they should connect. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I wanted to show you guys also, I have a copy of the web design book. a PDF. And by the way, I don't think it's a secret at this point, but this PDF is readily available online. So although I also have a physical copy of the book that I actually look at and think about quite often, but I think this is pretty handy as well, especially for students who don't want to wait for their copy to come in the mail. But if you do a search, I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that this book is going to come up. Obviously, I can't send you the PDF just because that might get me into some hot water, which I'm not interested in. But if you can find a copy of this online, I encourage you to use it. So anyway, we're looking at chapter 1, structure. And essentially HTML, an HTML page, we had kind of talked or touched upon this briefly with Project Zero. It's a structural document, and that's essentially what this first chapter is talking about. I'm just kind of moving forward a little bit quickly with all this business, but this is a good example right here of a basic structural map for an HTML page. So you can kind of see there's the opening tag for HTML and the closing HTML tag. And essentially what that is doing is it's telling the browser, hey, this is an HTML document. So all of the coding language beyond or within these these tags, it's going to be HTML language, because obviously there are different programming languages. There's CSS, which we'll be thinking about and talking about a little bit in this class, but there's also PHP, there's MySQL, there's JavaScript. I mean, there are a lot of different programming languages out there. Like I said, this class is really opening the door for you with HTML and a little bit of CSS. But if you want to be a web developer, you're going to have to start thinking about these other programming languages at some point, which do get a little bit more complicated. But if you're a structural, analytical, methodical thinker, it might be for you. And maybe just HTML and CSS is enough as well, and that's perfectly fine. I'm more of a guy, I just kind of like HTML and CSS to solve simple problems, because over the years, I've kind of realized that I really just want to draw and paint with and do a little bit of HTML and CSS on the side, but everyone has to make those decisions on their own terms. Anyway, so here's the body. And of course, within the body tags, that's where all the content is. In this particular example, there is no head portion of the HTML document, which we worked on in Project Zero. So actually, this one is a little bit behind the curve compared to what you already know. But you can see within the body portion of these tags, you can see all of this content that would be visually rendered on the page. Okay, so there's an H1 paragraph text, H2 paragraph text, and another H2 with some paragraph text. One thing I want to mention is that obviously you're very rarely going to, for example, start the content on a page with like an H4 or an H3. You're going to start with the H1, and then you're going to go to H2. And for some reason they went to another H2, but you could go to an H3 and then go back to an H2. It kind of depends, because, and this is a really good issue to kind of discuss or brainstorm just a little bit regarding your resume, because obviously I think your name on a web page should probably be the H1. And you might even include curriculum vitae or resume within that H1, because it's a very searchable term. And then an H2 might be education. Another H2 might be experience. An H3 might be maybe it's Diné College or another art school that you attended. So you can kind of see there's a hierarchy, or there's an order that you can start creating with these H2s, H1s, H3s. And then the paragraph text might be just an introduction about yourself, or maybe an artist statement. You know, again, you can structure this document however you choose, as long as you're kind of connecting the dots with these rules as far as the hierarchy on an HTML page. Okay. So that's kind of getting at the structure of things. If I think that you should also include on your document a head portion where you can give your website a title. Okay. This is kind of mapping out what we were just talking about. Look at it's showing you a visual diagram as to how the body portion of the HTML document is wrapped in these HTML tags. And within the body portion of the document is all the content, like the H1s and all the business that we were just talking about. I think this is interesting. It says the main heading, and again, this is a very important searchable aspect of a web page for like Google or any of those SEO spiders that are crawling through web pages for content. They're going to look at that H1 first. They are going to look at the H2s and the H3s. They're going to look at all of this content, but this is very, very important stuff. If you're creating a web page and it doesn't have an H1, that's a big red flag, and your SEO might not work as well. So yeah, this kind of maps out the structure, which correlates with a lot of the business that we just talked about here. And what I really like about, I prefer looking at it this way, to be perfectly honest, because you can see the indentation, you can see the parent-child or nesting relationship of these tags within the HTML document, okay? Um, I think that when you're talking about HTML and CSS, it's really important to kind of like know the language or the descriptive language, right? And so I'm not actually always good at that. Sometimes I'll call something a tag, something I'll mistakenly call something an element. But the truth is, these are tags, okay? And this is an opening tag, okay? And this is a closing tag. And there's a phrase that I heard, or maybe I read it somewhere, I don't know, but it says first one in. The phrase goes like this: first one in, last one out. So look at this. The first tag in is HTML, and the last one out is HTML. And you can kind of see then the body and then the closing. Now this is kind of interesting though. Because this has an opening and then it closes here, right? But because this closes, that means that all of this content is nested within the body, all right? So yeah, paying attention to that structure is very, very important, and also using the appropriate language to describe that structure. So an opening tag and a closing tag, all right? And attributes basically give value and to these tags. We'll learn more about that later, but it's just important to understand the name and the value of this business. I'll let you guys do that reading on your own. Okay, so here it is. Here is a very good page that maps out the structure of an HTML document. You have the body, you have the head, and you have the title. And of course, look at the title is actually nested within the head portion of the document. And then the content is nested within the body portion of the document. I love this book too, because it shows you the code and it shows you how things are going to be rendered. And by the way, look how things are like, it's not using, we haven't assigned a font or a color to any of this HTML yet. Right now, it's just raw structural code. And by default, a browser, I mean, you have to have some kind of default font associated with a browser. And each browser will actually by default render content differently, slightly differently. So if you have several browsers loaded on your machine, it might be interesting to kind of like load a simple HTML document in Google Chrome, Mozilla, and maybe Safari, and God forbid, Internet Explorer, which I heard, actually, I saw an article the other day that it is going to be permanently deprecated or gone away with, which is a good thing for web designers and developers, because Internet Explorer is habitually just a very difficult browser to work with. It doesn't do things very, very well. It often screws up content on a web page. if it's really complicated. So sometimes you'll even tell folks, hey, don't look at my web page using Internet Explorer, use Mozilla or Chrome if possible. But that's a whole nother story. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself, and you'll have to excuse me because I sometimes have a tendency to do that with web design, because it is sort of difficult to talk about this stuff chronologically, because you realize that everything is constantly interrelated, even with content that is supposed to be more advanced. I mean, I think it's helpful to just kind of introduce those little nuggets of information earlier on. Okay, moving on. Okay, I think this particular page, it says creating a web page on a PC. It's going to talk about Notepad, using Notepad to do the Hello World example. And then there's also an example where you can use a Mac to do the Hello World example. And essentially the difference is that by default on a PC, you're going to get this software application called Notepad, which you could use. And also by default on a Mac, you're going to get this software application called TextEdit, which you can use to create the Hello World tutorial. So it kind of depends on the type of machine that you're on. But I think for this class, I advised you guys to directly just download a free HTML text editing application almost immediately, so that you guys could just kind of get going with a more articulate way to render your code. So in my opinion, why use TextEdit when you can use brackets or another free HTML application just right off the bat? But the one thing about this is it does show how accessible HTML is and how simple it is. So yeah. Okay, the content management system. This is maybe going to talk about, like, a content management system is something like WordPress or Joomla, and we're not even close to having that conversation yet. I'm glad they're introducing the information. But yeah, when you start thinking about using WordPress, essentially what they're talking about is a quote unquote content management system, or it's called a CMS. All right. And WordPress is the big CMS these days, and it's the one that's going to continue to grow very, very quickly. So when you decide to graduate from HTML and CSS into a content management system, you're definitely going to want to think about WordPress. Okay, it's kind of trying, this stuff is talking to you about how sites are quote unquote built, which is valuable information, but I'm gonna let you guys just kind of do those readings. So that's chapter 1. One thing I want to show you guys really quickly. Here it is. Actually, here we go. The way that I've structured these PDFs is that I'm letting you know what you should be reading for this particular project. So for this one, I didn't mention the introduction, but that goes without saying. Chapter 1 structure and chapter 2 text. And I'm also priming you guys for the quiz with these questions. So these are pretty much the exact questions that you're going to see during the quiz. So it's a good idea to review those questions and think about them while you're doing the reading, because I've actually pulled those questions out for a reason. I think they lead to important information that should resonate and stay with you as you're moving forward in this class. So this is no accident, me choosing these questions for you to think about. So it's something to pay attention to. These are the articles that you should be doing the readings for as far as the reading responses. So I just kind of wanted to mention that briefly. Also, I'm typically going through these chapters and pulling out the meat information that I think that you should be focused on. So obviously, the structure of pages, knowing the difference between an element and a tag, okay? The attributes, and then of course we've talked about it several times at this point, the body, the head, and the HTML tag, and how those make up the primary structure of a web page. And then you add things to the head and the body, right? And within the body is all the visible content, and within the head is all the invisible content. That's the best way I can really summarize that. So let's just jump in there. Let's go to project 0. And what I'm going to do, usually what I would advise you guys to do is to just if you've been working on project 0 and there's an index.html file already in there and it's resolved, I would say, well, just right click and duplicate this entire folder and then rename it project 1. But since I already have a project 1 folder, I'm not going to do that. But because the work that we're going to be doing in this class is cumulative, or it builds upon itself, you can literally just do one project and then duplicate it and then duplicate that project and, you know, just continue down this road of duplication and add to your document as you're learning more about HTML through the textbook. But what I'm going to do is, since I'm not going to copy the entire folder, I am going to copy that index.html. And then I'm going to place it in this file folder. And I'm going to open that index.html file with my HTML editor, which I prefer, which is brackets. But you can use any HTML editing software application. It's they all pretty much look the same. They might operate slightly differently, but it's pretty much all the same. So I'm going to start modifying this document. I'm going to call this one Matthew Bollinger resume. And the other thing I'm going to add in here for search engine optimization is I'm going to say Matthew Bollinger artist, okay? Because this is going to be the title of the page. And then now we have our body, and that's where we're going to plug in. I'm going to hit Command S for save. And I kind of have an idea of what I need to do in my mind for a CV or a resume. But what I'm going to start with are just H tags. So I'm going to delete all this other information. Oops. And for the H1, I'm actually going to use the same exact title of the page, but I'm going to make it visible on the actual page itself by including it as an H1. So Matthew Bollinger artist resume, or you could say curriculum vitae, depending on I mean, a CV is considered more quote unquote academic, and a resume is considered more appropriate for just getting a job. But a CV is really a snapshot of everything. So really, I mean, I would call this, let's just call it a CV. So now I'm going to create an H2. I'm going to call it, I'm going to start structuring my document with content education. And for mine, I want to include solo exhibitions. And by the way, you know, sometimes instead of typing out all this stuff again, why not just hit Command C and copy, hit Command V, and then just change the text. So work smarter, not harder. You know, in HTML, you're doing a lot of copying and pasting because we're not reinventing the wheel. This is HTML software and it's accessible to everyone. So I'm going to say solo shows. And I'm going to say group shows. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to include just projects. And then I'm going to include, I'm just doing this intuitively, but I'm also maybe thinking about a specific precedent or example. So projects, I guess publications. And then maybe references. And that's, now we have one H1, and then we have a multitude of H2s, right? And when these render, these are all going to be the same size. So we're trying to create some structure and order. So I know, like, let's say I have a couple degrees, and I'm not going to detail this information right now, but I'm going to use an H3 for this circumstance. I'm just going to call it item 1. And I'm going to call this one item 2. Okay. And for solo shows, I don't think I need to use an H3. I'm just going to start using a paragraph. Okay, so I'm just going to call this item 1 for now, okay? And this is paragraph text. It's not an H3 because I don't want it to be as large as a header. I want it to be more subtle. And obviously there might be 4 of these paragraph items. 3, 4. Hit Command S for save. And just because you might be curious about how things are looking, you can come over here to project 1, open with, or right click. And that's how things are looking right now. So you can kind of see, it's important visually to kind of compare the two, just how they do in the book. You know, this is my H1, so you can kind of see it's a little bit larger. This is my H2. This is my H2. So you can kind of see that these are all in a very kind of, they have a consistent hierarchy. And I made the choice to make these 2 items H3s, but you'll have to make that decision on your own, okay? And then I have these items that represent line items for solo shows. I'm gonna have to do the same thing over here under group shows. I'm gonna hit Command S, come back here, and then hit Command R for refresh, right? And now that stuff is showing. By the way, if you don't save here, and if you come over here and hit Command R refresh, if you have not saved your actual document, you're not going to see the changes. So you have to be very mindful and careful about that. It's also a really bad idea to have multiple files open at once. It can actually, it can get very, very confusing quickly, especially because if you have a lot of index.html files and they're all living in different file locations, you have to make sure that you're editing the right file that's corresponding to the right project, if that makes sense. So don't get your wires crossed, okay? You have to be very specific about the file that you're editing and working on. Otherwise, you can get a little bit topsy-turvy. I've seen it happen with students. So just kind of giving you a heads up or a warning. Projects, I would do the same thing. You know, I just have these items and I'm just kind of laying out the general structure for these guys initially. It was trying to indent that over, but I don't think that's necessary. And I'll tell you why, because this item is not living. It's not a child of that item, okay? So that's why we're not going to indent it over. So I would just encourage you to continue going down this path and thinking about how you want to, in a very kind of generic way, structure your artist CV or design CV. Let's go back here. I want to bring up, I think that pretty much covers it as far as what I want you to be thinking about as far as tags, except for a couple things. Hold on. Because you're supposed to look at the text document too. And here's the page that kind of, you know, unpacks headings and how they look. Look at this, kind of what we were reviewing over here, right? Okay, let's go back to our text. Paragraphs, we're using that a little bit, okay? This is kind of important. I would like for you guys to use bold and italic text, and essentially what you would do is, for example, they've simplified it to just the simple B or I. So how do you do that? You come in here, and that actually would be embedded within it's trying to see, it's kind of making a mistake right here because you want this text to be inside there. So now let's hit Command S. Now let's go back and render or hit refresh. Let's see here, 1 second. Yep. That's a bad example to do that in, and I just realized that because an H3 is by default already bold, right? So that was my faux pas. So I'm going to correct it. I'm going to go to, I'm just going to put this back as item 1 as an H3, but you'll see the difference as paragraph text. Okay, so I'm going to hit save again. Go back here, Command R. Now you can see, look at how this is bold. All right. Now I'm going to do the same thing with, and again, instead of working harder, I'm going to copy this entire thing, drop it in, change this to 2, and change this to I. And look, it's giving me an error. Look, it's saying, hey, this doesn't compute. This is the advantage of having a text. Hold on, my computer is about to die. I need to make sure it's plugged in. 1 second, guys. Okay. So I need to change this B to an I, and now that error notification has gone away. I need to hit Command S, come over here, hit Command R, and look, I have bold and italic now. And again, it didn't work here because that was an H3, right? And so it's already by default being bolded. I don't even know if that's a word, but yeah, it's already bold because it's a header. So yeah, this is a good start, and I trust that you guys will kind of make this project unique and individualized for your own goals, personally and professionally, and kind of a snapshot of how you see yourself in 5, maybe 10 years, which I think it's really, really important to envision those things, so that you know where you're going, or you have an idea of where you want to be going. In particular, in the art design world, and I guess life in general, time moves so fast. You really need to set those goals very, very quickly and start moving towards them. So this project is geared for that reason. And I think that covers it. And I'll look forward to reviewing your projects. Have a good day. Bye.